Michael always thought he was protecting his mother, Eleanor, but one mistake turned decades of love into a tragedy he could never undo. Michael had always felt a strong bond with his mother, Eleanor, a woman whose life seemed to stretch back into another era. At 95, she was frail and fragile, but her eyes carried the sharpness and clarity of a woman who had lived through nearly a century of change. Her small house was filled with memories, faded photographs of family gatherings, yellowed letters from friends and relatives long gone, and furniture worn smooth by decades of daily use. Every corner of the house spoke of a life lived fully, yet quietly, and Michael had spent years cherishing the comfort and stability it provided him. Growing up without a father, he had leaned on Eleanor for guidance, love, and protection, and now, as an adult, he felt a deep responsibility to care for her in her final years. In the beginning, caring for her seemed simple enough. He made sure she had her meals, reminded her to take her pills, and helped her navigate the small challenges of aging. But as her health slowly declined, Michael found himself more involved, more controlling, and increasingly concerned with her safety. Eleanor's memory began to falter. She would forget whether she had eaten or taken her medication, sometimes leaving the stove on or wandering to the mailbox in her nightgown. Michael felt a constant tension in his chest, an anxiety that she might hurt herself if he wasn't vigilant. He started administering her medication with greater care, adjusting doses to ensure she remained calm and comfortable. At first, it seemed like a small, necessary act, just helping her sleep or easing her discomfort. But over time, Michael began to notice subtle patterns. Small accidents happened frequently. Eleanor would slip on the bathroom tiles or trip over the carpet edges. Each time, he was there to catch her, tending to her bruises and pretending that nothing serious had occurred. It was easy to rationalize, he told himself. She was old, and accidents were bound to happen. Then came the night that changed everything. Eleanor struggled to breathe, her body shaking with the effort, and Michael panicked. In a rush of fear and love, he administered a stronger dose of her medication, hoping to ease her suffering. As her breathing slowed and eventually stopped, a strange mix of relief and terror washed over him. She had passed quietly, and yet, in the quiet, Michael could feel a gnawing unease he couldn't shake. The house, so full of her presence for decades, now felt empty, silent, and judgmental. In the days that followed, Michael immersed himself in preparations for the funeral, presenting himself as the devoted son to friends, neighbors, and distant relatives. Everyone praised him for his dedication, and the authorities quickly ruled Eleanor's death as natural, citing her age and declining health. Yet, despite the outward appearance of normality, Michael could not silence the inner voice that whispered doubts, fear, and guilt. At night, her absence weighed on him like a physical presence. Shadows in the corners of rooms seemed to stretch and shift, and he imagined her fragile form walking silently behind him. As he moved through the house alone, memories of her filled every room. The kitchen smelled faintly of her cooking. The living room retained the faint scent of her perfume, and the bedroom still held the warmth of her presence. Michael began to question every choice he had made, every decision he had taken in those final, desperate days. Each action, once justified in his mind as care and protection, now seemed tinged with uncertainty. He could not escape the thought that perhaps his devotion had crossed an invisible line, that his attempts to protect had brought about an irreversible outcome. The weight of that possibility pressed down on him, shaping the unease that would follow him in the days, weeks, and months to come. The funeral passed in a blur of flowers, somber faces, and condolences that seemed to echo in Michael's mind long after the guests had gone. Neighbors whispered about how devoted he had been, and distant relatives remarked on the love he had shown in Eleanor's final years. Michael nodded politely, accepting the praise, but inside he felt a gnawing emptiness he could not explain. The house, once warm with Eleanor's laughter and stories, now felt cold and alien. Each room seemed to remember her presence, every object a silent reminder that she was gone. Her chair in the living room sat untouched, the cushions still indented from where she had spent her afternoons reading. Her bed remained neatly made, as if she might return at any moment, and the faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, teasing Michael with memories he could not escape. In the days that followed, Michael tried to return to a sense of normalcy, but the quiet of the house pressed down on him. He moved through it like a ghost, avoiding the rooms that reminded him most of Eleanor. The kitchen felt particularly oppressive. The lingering aroma of her favorite meals seemed to mock him, each smell triggering flashes of her frailty and the moments when he had administered her medication. At night, sleep came in fits, interrupted by dreams of Eleanor falling, gasping for breath or staring at him with eyes full of confusion and fear. Waking from these dreams left him drenched in sweat, heart racing, and unable to shake the overwhelming sense of guilt that had begun to take root. Michael found himself obsessively checking every detail of Eleanor's belongings. Her medication bottles were lined up on the counter, and he studied the labels repeatedly, tracing the dosages she had been prescribed. He went over the timeline of her last days, recalling the small accidents and the moments when he had given her more than what the prescription required. Each memory was like a needle pressing against his conscience, and the more he examined them, the heavier the weight became. He wondered if someone else had noticed these discrepancies, if the neighbors or a distant relative had seen the signs he had tried so desperately to hide. The house seemed to respond to his anxiety. Objects were often out of place, though he knew he had not moved them. Notes Eleanor had written, once neatly stacked, appeared scattered across surfaces, as if reminding him of the life he had failed to protect. The clock ticked loudly in the silence, marking the passage of time in a way that felt accusatory. Michael began to question whether he had acted out of love or selfishness, whether his decisions, made under the guise of care, had pushed Eleanor toward her final breath sooner than nature intended. Even outside the house, Michael felt the weight of his actions. Passing by familiar streets, he imagined Eleanor walking beside him, fragile and trusting, and a shiver of regret ran through him. Friends reached out, inviting him to gatherings, but he declined, retreating into the isolation of his own thoughts. The world outside continued, indifferent to his turmoil, while he became increasingly consumed by visions of Eleanor's final days. Every corner of his mind seemed occupied by her memory, and he could not escape the haunting idea that the life he had been entrusted to protect had ended in his hands. The longer he lived with this internal torment, the more Michael realized that the peace he had once sought in caring for his mother was gone. Her absence was no longer just a fact of death, but a force that shaped his every action, every thought. The quiet of the house, once comforting, now seemed like a courtroom in which he was the accused, and Eleanor the silent witness to every misstep, every moment of failure. He understood that moving forward would be impossible without confronting the truth of what he had done, and the shadows of guilt began to stretch across his days and nights, relentless and unyielding. Months passed, but the quiet of the house became unbearable for Michael. The emptiness that had once seemed peaceful now pressed in on him like a weight he could not shake. Every object, every photograph, every piece of furniture seemed to whisper reminders of Eleanor's life and the role he had played in its end. He wandered through the rooms aimlessly, touching surfaces she had once touched, inhaling the lingering scent of her perfume, and feeling the sharp pangs of regret twist in his chest. The house no longer felt like a home. It had become a museum of memories, each one accusing him silently. One afternoon, while cleaning Eleanor's bedroom, Michael noticed a loose floorboard near the bed. Curious, he pried it up and discovered a stack of papers Eleanor had kept hidden. They were meticulously organized, written in her small, precise handwriting. As he read, a sense of dread began to build in his stomach. The papers contained detailed notes about her health, her medications, and her daily routines. Each entry carefully recorded the times she had taken her medicine, the dosages, and her reactions. Michael's hands shook as he compared these notes with his own actions during her final days. Every small accident, every extra dose, every adjustment he had made in her care began to feel sinister, though his intention had always been to help her. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had unintentionally crossed the line from care into harm. The medications he had given to ease her discomfort had, in some cases, exceeded what she could safely tolerate. The falls he had dismissed as minor accidents could have been avoided if he had been more careful, and yet he had been distracted, overwhelmed, and sometimes careless in his efforts. Each detail in Eleanor's notes sharpened the truth he had tried to ignore, and Michael felt the icy grip of panic tighten around him. Michael became consumed by the records he had found. He spent hours reconstructing the timeline of her last days, comparing the entries with his own recollections. He began to see patterns he could not unsee, inconsistencies that revealed the unintended consequences of his actions. Every memory of her fragile frame, her trembling hands, and her trusting eyes took on a new, terrifying meaning. The guilt he had carried in the weeks after her death was nothing compared to the overwhelming horror of understanding that he had directly contributed to her passing. Sleep became impossible. Michael spent nights pacing the house, the notes clutched in his hands, replaying every moment over and over. Shadows in the corners of rooms seemed to shift and lengthen, forming shapes that resembled Eleanor. He could hear her voice in his mind, a mixture of confusion, fear, and disappointment. He tried to escape the torment by leaving the house, walking aimlessly through the streets. But the images followed him. Her face haunted him in every reflection, every passing window, every still surface. Michael's isolation deepened. Friends' calls went unanswered, invitations ignored, and family kept at a distance. The truth he had uncovered in Eleanor's hidden notes consumed his every thought. He realized that the world outside would never understand the complexity of his feelings, the mixture of love, fear, and misguided care that had led to her death. He felt trapped in a relentless cycle of guilt and obsession, knowing that he could never undo what had been done. Every step forward only led him deeper into the shadows of the past, where Eleanor's presence lingered, silent but unmistakably present, reminding him of the irreversible consequences of his actions. Michael's life began to unravel in ways he could never have anticipated. The house, once a place of safety and comfort, now seemed alive with Eleanor's absence, each creaking floorboard and shifting shadow amplifying his anxiety. Even the sunlight streaming through the windows felt accusatory, highlighting dust motes in the air as if they were silent witnesses to his failures. Every day brought a fresh wave of panic, each moment spent alone intensifying the weight of guilt he could not escape. He tried to occupy his mind with mundane tasks, cleaning, organizing, fixing broken furniture, but nothing could drown out the constant gnawing sense that he had crossed an unforgivable line. At night, Michael's thoughts became relentless. He replayed Eleanor's last days with obsessive detail, memorizing every cough, every tremor, every fleeting expression of pain or confusion. The small decisions he had made, once justified by love and concern, now appeared in a horrifying new light. Every extra pill, every moment he had allowed her to stumble, every minor injury he had dismissed as an accident, took on the weight of culpability. His mind refused to rest, and sleep became a distant memory, replaced by visions of Eleanor's fragile body, her trusting eyes staring at him from every shadow. As his mental state deteriorated, Michael began to isolate himself completely. Calls from friends went unanswered, visits from distant relatives were avoided, and even the few neighbors who had once admired his devotion stopped trying to reach him. He found solace only in the silence of the house, though it was a hollow comfort. The walls seemed to close in, carrying echoes of Eleanor's voice, her laughter, and her coughs. He could not tell whether these sounds were real or the manifestations of his own guilt. He began to feel as if the house itself was judging him, each room a tribunal where he was constantly reminded of his actions. One day, a routine call from a nurse's hotline brought the impending consequences into sharp focus. They were following up on Eleanor's care and requested detailed records of her medication and health in her final weeks. Michael's hands shook as he realized the truth. The discrepancies in her notes and his own recollections could expose him. Panic set in fully for the first time. Every moment of care that had once felt justified now seemed like a potential crime, and the weight of that realization pressed down on him with suffocating intensity. Overcome with fear, Michael confided in a close friend, sharing the full extent of what had happened. He admitted the mistakes he had made, the extra doses, the accidents, and the growing terror that he had directly contributed to his mother's death. The friend, shocked and alarmed, urged him to contact the authorities and seek legal counsel. It was a terrifying step, but Michael knew he could no longer live under the crushing weight of secrecy and guilt. The act of confessing brought a temporary relief, though it was accompanied by the harsh reality that legal consequences were inevitable. The next days were filled with an anxious waiting, as investigators were called in to review Eleanor's medical records, her medication, and Michael's own notes. He felt like he was living in a suspended reality, every sound amplified, every shadow a warning. He realized that the life he had tried to protect had ended in his hands, and now the full scope of that reality was confronting him with unrelenting force. Michael understood that the road ahead would be defined by accountability, and the burden of his actions would follow him relentlessly, shaping every thought, every step, and every moment of reflection in the years to come. When the investigators arrived, Michael felt a cold dread settle over him. They moved through the house with meticulous care, examining every corner, every surface, and every object that had once belonged to Eleanor. His mother's medication bottles were lined up for inspection, and the notes he had discovered months earlier were carefully photographed and catalogued. Michael's hands shook as he handed over the papers, each page a silent testament to the mistakes he had made, the choices that had seemed reasonable at the time, but now carried irreversible consequences. The air in the house felt heavy, thick with the presence of Eleanor's absence and the scrutiny of those who had come to uncover the truth. The investigators reviewed every detail with precision, comparing Eleanor's meticulous records with Michael's recollections and actions. Patterns began to emerge, small discrepancies that, when pieced together, painted a picture of a series of unintended but fatal missteps. Each additional dose of medication, each minor accident that had been brushed aside, was examined under the lens of consequence. Michael watched silently as the reality of his actions crystallized before him, the weight of his guilt now amplified by the undeniable evidence that linked him directly to his mother's death. When the investigation concluded, the findings were clear. Michael had not intended to kill his mother, but his repeated errors in administering her care and his failure to prevent accidents had directly contributed to her passing. The authorities determined that while his actions were born of misguided love, they carried serious legal ramifications. Michael faced charges of involuntary manslaughter, a designation that captured both the tragedy of his mother's death and the unintended consequences of his care. The reality of the legal consequences pressed down on him, adding to the emotional torment that had been building for months. News of the case spread quickly. Friends, neighbors, and even distant acquaintances were shocked by the story. A devoted son, caring for his elderly mother, had inadvertently caused her death. Reporters focused on the tragic irony of the situation, the blurred line between love and harm, and the fragile boundaries of human morality when confronted with responsibility. Michael's life became a subject of public scrutiny, and every action, every past decision was dissected under the unforgiving gaze of the media and the community. As the legal process unfolded, Michael was left to confront the personal consequences of his actions. Beyond the courtroom, beyond the judgments of strangers, he grappled with the deepest pain, the loss of his mother, and the knowledge that he had played a central role in her death. Nights remained sleepless, haunted by visions of Eleanor's fragile form, her trusting eyes, and the quiet moments of their life together that now could never be reclaimed. Each day was a struggle to reconcile the love he had felt with the harm he had caused, the devotion he had intended with the irreversible result. In the months that followed, Michael's world was forever altered. He faced legal penalties, community judgment, and the isolation that comes from carrying a heavy personal truth. Yet the most profound punishment was internal, the unrelenting awareness that he had destroyed the life of the woman who had given him everything, leaving an empty space in his heart that could never be filled. Michael understood that no legal ruling, no public acknowledgement, and no act of contrition could undo the consequences of his actions. Eleanor's absence became a constant companion, her memory both a guide and a torment, reminding him that love, even when sincere, can sometimes carry unintended and tragic consequences.